I've been involved in this. That study was 50 years ago, so I've been involved in some way for 50 years, and it's one that I'm more proud of than the average. It was the first cost-benefit analysis of regulation, and I've been a critic of FDA regulation for all of that period. So we have to. How much time do we have?
We have time.
Okay, so I got to explain what it is. He said, John said the efficacy requirement. So there's a history here. You have to understand what modern drug regulation is all about. In 1962, and I'm not going to go into the previous history which led to this, which is also interesting and has ironic twist. In 1962, Congress decided that the Food and Drug Administration needed to certify that a drug was A, safe, and B, efficacious before C, it could get sold on the ordinary medical market, which is basically selling to doctors and today to insurance companies. Okay, so up to that time, A was on the books. B was added and needed to be defined. What does efficacious? Well, it was defined to mean that you have to come, you are the drug researcher, manufacturer, prospective seller. You have to come to the FDA and you have to tell the FDA what you're going to claim. So you're going to claim a cure or a mitigation of ALS, as in this example. Okay. Then you have to sit down with the FDA and you have to map out a testing regimen that will start with A and then get to B. That is, you have to show it's safe, and then you're allowed to test for efficacy. And that means that you typically what you do is all of this is back and forth in negotiation with the regulator. You set up a random control trial where there's a treatment group, there's a control group. Okay, in this case, the control group might be ALS patients who are not going to get this drug. They're going to get whatever you do for ALS patients without this drug. Then you get this treatment group, and then you give them the drug. And at the end of the random controlled trial, which is specified in the regulatory document that you're negotiating with the FDA, you have an outcome. And let's say that the treatment group did better, but the risk, if you've taken an elementary course in statistics, you know what I'm talking about. The risk of making an error, of saying it did better when it really didn't, is 6%. You can't market it because the protocol usually says, we read a statistics textbook and they use 5%. That's the rule forever since Ronald Fisher started this branch of statistics. You promised 5%. You came up with 6%. No, you can't sell it. So that's the regime. You have to pass. It's called stage 3, which is the efficacy test. All right. Now, if you think about it, that has a benefit. It keeps some drugs which really don't work off the market by any stretch of the imagination. But then you have to ask, why would the seller have gone through all the trouble of spending the money on the stage 3 trial if they really feared that would be the outcome? So that's not going to be a common a problem. You'll also catch risks that you can catch in a trial, uh, 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 safety risks that you didn't know about before, but they turn up later. You'll catch a few of those, and that's the benefit. The cost is the opportunity. You have an enormously expensive process, which costs resources, but the biggest cost is the opportunity cost. That is to say, it takes time to do all of this. We know what the time is from application to approval or rejection. That's in itself a year and a half. So we have an application, which means the seller thinks they got something. And they think they have willing customers, and they like to get approval. And then it takes a year and a half. And this is after the stage 3 trial is finished, and the Food and Drug Administration evaluates the results, and it goes to an advisory panel. There's a whole process of back and forth with the data. And then they approve or disapprove. So that is the biggest cost. But the incentives are, at this point, very heavily in favor of that drug having at least some beneficial effect, often a very beneficial, life-saving effect. And in effect, that benefit can't be had for a year and a half minimum while they evaluate the data. And empirically, that opportunity cost overwhelms everything. So you've had, for example, great advances in heart disease. A lot of them are pharmaceutical advances. Heart disease kills hundreds of thousands of people, even today, every single year. You can imagine you get a drug that can reduce that by a few thousand, and you wait a year and a half. You're killing thousands of people effectively. That's what you're doing. It's a death sentence for thousands of people. And the benefits, there are benefits, but they're overwhelmed by this. So you get it becomes, look, the FDA is a political creature. It becomes a political game. Can I bring pressure on the FDA to speed up? Can I do this or can I do that to make approval more likely? And so on and so forth. And the FDA sometimes responds. But again, you got the collective action problem, Mansour-Olson's problem. Unless you're organized, you can't get them to move, except in crisis. So you might remember a couple of years ago, we started developing vaccines for COVID. And you had so-called Operation Warp Speed, which a couple of my colleagues were very heavily involved. You know what Warp Speed really was? It was telling the FDA that if we get some positive results, we're going to short circuit the process. So you had an emergency use authorization. You know what an emergency use or it says we're not at the end of stage 3, but look, we're going to be blown out of the water politically if we don't say yes. So we're going to say yes, you can use it. My very strong view is that every drug should have an emergency use authorization, including these ALS drugs. You know, they might not work. They might work a little bit. You know, suppose I'm a doctor and I read that it has potential benefits. Not yet The stage 3 hasn't been complete. The FDA is gestating the data. Okay. I'm a doctor. I have this patient. ALS is a death sentence today. The FDA is telling me I cannot get that drug unless I go. I can apply for an emergency use authorization and so on. But who am I, an ordinary doctor, to play that game? The drug company would have to do it, and the drug company is going to have to deal with the FDA many times in the future. They're very conservative about that. They don't want to get in bad with the regulator who has their future at stake. So it's not going to happen unless they go to Canada. And how absurd is that? The Canadians are dumber than we are about drugs. Anyway, I could go on, but it's a good example of where the broad interest really isn't represented. There's no the interest that's represented is the drug companies who have. They once they apply, they want to get approval. If they have a drug that's approved, they don't want the competitor to get approved. So they're not opponents of the system. They've learned how to use it. And you've got a medical establishment, research establishment that has some weight because they sit on these panels that evaluate the data. And that's a pretty nice life's work. And you have consultants who try to push things through, and you have an industry which, if you have a drug startup, you're going to end up selling out to one of the big drug companies only because they can get the stuff through the process and you can't. So there's really no prospect that, except in crisis, like the COVID crisis, or previously the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, which did lead to organized political action. It was a small group was bearing the biggest cost. They organized and they got enough pressure on the FDA to accelerate the process. But the process will continue, and I think it's one of the few things that I feel pretty strongly about. It's a death sentence for thousands of people